There's also something called the noise. I mean, I call it the noise because I don't know what else to call it. It's a noise that is sometimes like a white noise. There's not a ventilation system in here, but you know, that kind of hum of the air conditioner, sort of, that kind of, or the, not a vacuum, but that low-level hum. Sometimes people hear all the way down to your basic chorus of angelic voices. Some people say that they hear a sound like the sound of hundreds of silver bells hanging on branches blowing in a breeze. You know, just the beautiful melodies, sort of like the music of the universe. You know, the welling up and the expression through music of the universe. I think it's wonderful that in the old movie, in Close Encounters, that the way, you know, the aliens communicated with us was through music. It's really, there are universal sounds that are ageless as well. There's also a darkness or a void, not to be confused with a tunnel, where people find themselves, it's not unpleasant, people find themselves in a warm, comfortable, but dark place, kind of like my dark fog. And the fog goes from a light gray to a very, you know, black kind of substance. And there's no floor, ceiling, or sides. It's like a void, but it's not scary.
Floated upward and noticed, and what was floating, I didn't feel like I was floating in my body, it just felt like there was a consciousness floating upward. But I noticed just opposite me was a little wisp of smoke floating a few feet away from me. And that little wisp of smokiness was, I understood, my spirit. It finally came to a place where there was a darkening in a darkening around me a little, and my spirit began to funnel through what was this darkened place that was kind of like the drain at the bottom of a sink. The spirit started to spiral through it, a little bit of smokiness. And my perspective outside of my spirit began to move closer to that smokiness until finally I was inside the smoke as it was spiraling through.
For me, it was kind of like being on a bus platform, sort of, because while I was in this you know, grayness, this darkness, I really did have the sense that I was waiting for something as well. But in the same kind of emotional state as I would wait for a plane or a bus to come by, you know, something that I knew was going to pick me up, as opposed to, you know, anxiously wondering if someone was going to come and get me. So that's the darkness and void. Then there's the dark tunnel. It's called a tunnel because it has rounded sides and it's dark. And people in this tunnel are not waiting for a bus. They're moving, even if the movement is only slightly head forward, but it's always head first. And it is always traveling towards something at the end, usually a light.
I came into a tunnel. It was a dark, almost black tunnel, although occasionally a little bit of light would shoot past me. And I began to float, not to move rapidly, but to float rather slowly along the tunnel, and in the distance was a disc, an extraordinary light.
And in most cases, it's alone, but not always. There's someone in the room today who, actually Betty Preston, I'll use her name, who saw pets with her in the tunnel. The only other time I heard about someone not alone in the tunnel at least not alone with a human, was a woman who wrote to me from Olympia many years ago who said that in World War II her husband was stationed overseas. She was driving a car, had a very bad car accident, found herself coming out of her body, found herself in a tunnel, traveling towards a great light with her husband. And together they went the distance of this tunnel. And at the end of the tunnel, he spilled on into this light, and she was sucked backwards. And she said that it was then that she knew her husband died, not a few days later when a couple of men came to the door knocking, saying how very sorry they were that her husband had indeed died in France. Battle of the Bulge, I think. And she said although she'd never remarried, it was just circumstantial, but she was comforted beyond measure by the fact that she knew not only where her husband was, but that she would join him when whatever it was she was sent back to do was accomplished. And she had a peace about that. The most heartfelt aspect of a near-death experience, though, in my opinion, is the meeting of others. And to run quickly through who you might meet in a near-death experience, most commonly it's deceased loved ones. And that's why I think this is the most heartfelt part of a near-death experience, because people who, I'm going to assume at this point in time, at our ages, that just about everybody here can think of someone that they care about who has died. Okay? It is one thing to hope that we see that person again. It's another thing to believe, because of one's spiritual or religious backgrounds, that we will see one again. But it's yet another experience altogether to really and truly have that reunion. To really be literally face to face with someone that we love again. And what's fascinating about these encounters is that the people who have died ahead, the person having the near-death experience, appears in the flesh of their life. Another woman with great tears told a story about how she had a foster child who was wheelchair-bound with spinal bifida, and he ran up to her in her near-death experience, just, you know, from a distance, just ran, and like, look at me, with such happiness and such joy did they, you know, encounter each other again. It's really wonderful. Sometimes the encountering of others are spiritual beings.
But there's one person that I didn't know that was not familiar. And we communicated, and that person told me that I had to go back.
There was these white clouded figures, and I kind of sat there and watched them. They just kind of hovered around for a while. And they never approached me, and I never approached them, but they kind of gave me like a warmth and love.
People have a tendency to stick a name on these beings. Jesus is one, St. Michael, St. Gabriel. And it's not like these beings wear name tags, you know, hello, my name is, you know, your Lord and Savior. But people just know, and you cannot talk these people out of it. I mean, you know, there's skeptics who say, well, you know, so you're a Christian, so, you know, of course you're going to see Jesus. And there is just no explaining how people know who they are encountering.
I might add one thing, that when Mark was 3, right after his trach was out, we took him to South Dakota to the Passion Play. He did not understand what the Passion Play was. The curtain opened up and a man was standing there like this, and Mark said, "That's my Jesus and I'm going." And I said, "Sit down. It's a man." He said, "No." He said, "I could come back to him and I'm going now." And I'm like, what are you talking about? We didn't understand him until 2 years later when he said to us, "That was my Jesus."
And
I began to float, not to move rapidly, but to float rather slowly along the tunnel, and in the distance was a disc, an extraordinary light, with shapes moving past the opening. And the shapes were a kind of reddish orange, and sometimes they'd be blue-green, and the shapes were beautiful, just beautiful. As beautiful as anything I've ever seen in my life. So there I was, feeling more serene than I'd ever felt in my life, looking at something more beautiful than I'd ever seen in my life. And it was all pretty wonderful.
the light is universally described as alive, a love that is more magnificent, penetrating, and personal than anything you've ever experienced in your whole life on earth. That it's brighter than 1,000,000 suns, but it doesn't hurt the eyes. And interestingly, it doesn't illuminate the tunnel. As bright as this light is, the tunnel itself remains dark. It's not an illuminating light. It illuminates us from within. But it's not like sunlight or lamplight or stage light. It's a beautiful light. I want to absolutely take time for questions and get through one other common, I'm speaking of just the most common aspects of near-death experience. Another one of my favorites is a life review. Now really it's not that common to have a life review. But it used to be that the only people who were resuscitated were drowning victims, because we knew how to get water, out of a person's body. And these people, for some reason, would, throw up and then talk about their life review. And so that's how it came to, in the very early days of starting, to look at this kind of phenomena where it was thought that the life review was one of the most common. It really isn't. But when it happens, it's wonderful in many ways because of the lessons that are available to us when this happens to us. Some people see their lives from the womb on. Some people from the moment of birth on. And for some people, it starts there and ends at the moment of the near-death experience. For some people, it's backwards. Things are in reverse. Many people have said that it's like a slideshow, except they could hold the slides up like to a light and see all the slides simultaneously. One woman described it sitting on a large chair with an enormous book. It was her book of life on her lap, and she could turn the pages any which way she wanted, and front and back on the pages were little movies, like 16mm movies of her life going. So those are the most common aspects of a near-death experience. I want to anticipate a question about suicide and tell you that anyone who ends up at Harborview Medical Center because of the critical care unit because of a suicide attempt really meant it, and were found in some freak way. This was not like a gesture for attention. They hung themselves, burned themselves, stabbed themselves, poisoned themselves. They did something they really meant to die. And in all those years, I haven't talked to a soul, literally, who had a frightening experience. I also haven't talked to anybody who would even think about hurting themselves again. And one of the things that I learned in my near-death experience is that if you didn't create it, you can't destroy it. There are cosmic rules. Okay, there are, as you heard last night, consequences to our behavior and even our thoughts. Okay, so, but the people who do attempt suicide and have a near-death experience learn a lesson. You don't escape your problems when this life is over. Whether you want to take your own life or not, you don't escape your problems. I mean, there's still lessons to be learned. My opinion is that this is school anyway. This is it. This is where the rubber meets the road, folks. We're here to do a job. And that job is to love one another and to teach about love and to be kind to one another and to help one another, because we're all going to be sort of stuck here until the last person is ready to move forward. And that's why it's so important to help each other out.